Hi, welcome back to another video. I'm Caleb, and today I'll be building a snowboard. And in the end of the video, we'll test it out and hopefully get down the mountain in one piece. The snowboard is made up of a number of different materials that get layered together and pressed in a mold to create its shape. And that's exactly what I'm working on right now. With the goal of keeping costs down and for the ease of shaping, I decided to use a high-density pink foam board to form the mold. While it did have a high enough compression rating for what I'd be doing, its lack of stiffness did cause a few issues later on that I'll get to. After ripping the sheet apart, I cut the pieces down to the length I would need for my mold. Originally, I thought I'd only need it 12 inches wide, but I soon realized I would actually need it a little bit more. So to fix that, I put 3 of my offcuts in the middle of the rows where they get glued together with the rest. With the large chunk of foam now glued up, I traced out the profile and shape of my current snowboard to give me a reference when cutting the mold shape. Then after cutting them on the bandsaw, I traced it onto my foam. However, that's when I realized the first of many mistakes that arose during this project. So I just realized I made a bit of a mistake here. Originally, I was planning to only have 6 rows, and with 6 rows I could have still went ahead and then cut my profile on the bandsaw. But when I decided to make it wider and make it 7 rows with this one, I didn't think about it, but now it is too wide to run through the bandsaw. Which, it's not a problem, it just creates a little more work. What I'm going to have to end up doing is I'm just going to cut it down the middle again, cut my profile in 2 separate pieces, and then glue it back together after that. Then back at the bandsaw, I split apart my foam block back into 2 pieces and then went ahead with cutting the profile of my snowboard into the foam blocks. Now I can re-glue them together, and once dry, sand away the bandsaw marks. And just like that, the mold is done. With that out of the way, we can actually get to the fun stuff and work on the board itself. First thing was just finishing cutting out the templates from the shapes traced earlier, which is pretty important as it will dictate the final shape of the board. Now, onto the first piece of the snowboard, the base, which is made from an ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, which in English means a durable and low-friction plastic. Alright, so now that we have this template made, I'm going to take this base material for the board, which I ordered online. I'm just going to unwrap this. Wow, that's a very sticky tape. There we go. Just gonna open this up. After tracing the template, I realized that was kind of pointless, as I could just tape it down with double-sided tape before cutting out the shape. Now I can take this over to the bandsaw, and then we can trace around here, and then we'll come back and then flush trim it to match the template. Then after cutting it out on the bandsaw, being careful not to hit the template, I flush trimmed away the excess material at the router. The next natural step would have been to wrap the steel edges around the base, but knowing that wasn't going to be exactly easy, I decided to put that off for future me to deal with and begin with working on the wood core of the snowboard. The two most common materials are aspen and poplar. I opted to use poplar for the bulk of it since, well, that's all I actually had available, as well as 2 strips of ash, as you'll see later on. The core is constructed out of numerous strips rather than one wide board to minimize any weaknesses in the wood and create a more stable panel. With all of the strips cut out, I arranged them like this, with the ash pieces towards the center to give more pop when riding and increase stability underfoot. You might be thinking that looks a little thick for a snowboard, and you're right. That's because I knew I was going to want to make another board after this, so I made my thickness enough to resaw it into 3 different cores. After cleaning up one side of the drum sander, I tested out my resaw capabilities for the bandsaw for what seemed like hours, making just one cut through. But once finally done, I sanded the core down to 7mm, which would be the thickest part of the core. I then measured where I wanted my binding inserts to go and used a template I found online by The Good Roads to drill them out. The holes were then transferred from my template onto the core itself. The next step is the sidewalls, which help to protect the wood core from water damage. Most boards use either a urethane or a rot-resistant wood sidewall. I decided to use ironwood as it seemed like a simpler method, and honestly, I just like the look of wood better. After cutting out the curb, I sanded any irregularities from the cutaway and tested that the joint was tight. Once satisfied, I glued both of the sidewalls onto the core. You'll have to let me know if I use enough clamps here. Then, using a hand plane, I flushed up the sidewalls with the core and then cut the rough shape onto the ends. Next came tapering the core thickness to allow more flexibility in the board. This was probably my favorite part of the build, as it's just something so satisfying about shaving away wood with a hand plane. I wanted the ends of the core to be 2mm while retaining the 7mm thickness just past the last 2 binding insert holes. As far as the rate of the taper, I wasn't too sure. I just kept going and shaving away, keeping it flat widthwise until the flex felt and looked about right. Unfortunately, I lost the footage of cutting part of the tip away, but the point of that was to create a spot for the tip fill to go. It's this black material here that you see me cutting, which helps to protect the wood core from water damage, just like the sidewalls do, but for the ends. Then I finished tapering down the core to match the thickness of the fill. However, as you'll see later on, much of this work will unfortunately have been for nothing. Then, using the router, I recessed the bottom of the core where the binding inserts go so that they'd sit flush with the base. For the top sheet of the board, I resawed and sanded some African mahogany. Alright, now let's get back to the metal edges that wrap around the base. At first I tried just bending it with my hands, but after struggling for well over an hour with little progress, I decided I'd have to go build the edge bending tool. Basically, all I had to do was modify a pair of end nippers by grinding the sharpied out sections. Well, it might not be the prettiest, but it should make the job much easier, right? Nope. Turns out metal weakens after it gets bent back and forth over and over. Who would have guessed? Now, working with the two smaller sections, I began to slowly get a feel of how it worked, and managed to get half of it bent roughly to shape. Then I used some of these top-of-the-line wood clamps to hold the metal edge tightly against the base while applying super glue every couple of takes just to tack it on. The epoxy would later seal in when pressing to permanently attach it. Then I went ahead and did the other side, trimming off the excess edge, which I can't show since my camera battery went on strike. And just like that, I had all the parts I needed and began the prep work for pressing the board together. The first thing I did was trace the two outer insert holes onto the base and glued those inserts in place, which would help hold everything in alignment when it gets pressed. Then, using a little dab of super glue, I tacked the rest of the binding inserts in place just so they wouldn't fall out when flipping the core around. Okay, that brings us to the most exciting, but what was also probably the most stressful part of this project. Here, all the previous work will come together to form something that closely resembles a snowboard. But with a lot to lay up and the short working time of epoxy, it was definitely a bit of a rush to get it all done. To help with this, I acquired some shop help from my dad, which definitely did help things go a bit smoother. Firstly, I spread epoxy all over the top of the base, along with these strips of VDS rubber tape. The tape provides flexibility between the metal edge and the wood core, which helps prevent delamination in the future. Once that was covered, I rolled out the first layer of fiberglass and cut a little slit for the pre-glued binding inserts to stick through. Then after coating that layer with epoxy, I spread it over the bottom of the wood core before flipping it over and aligning the core with the inserts. This part was a little tricky as the inserts wanted to keep popping out of the core and shift the whole board out of alignment. But with a little downward pressure, we were able to get it to stay in place. Then a layer of fiberglass was rolled over that. Oh wait, Caleb, aren't you forgetting something? Yep. In that rush, somebody, me, forgot to put the tip and tail fill into the layup. While this thankfully shouldn't have too much of an impact on how the board rides, it might affect how it holds up over time. It was pretty frustrating seeing those pieces laying there once the whole thing was already in the press. After the final layer of fiberglass and epoxy, I laid the wood veneer on top using some masking tape to hold the two pieces together. Then I laid a breather fabric that's supposed to prevent everything from sticking to the mold on top of that. With everything now in the press, I threw on a ton of clamps. This was one of those spots where having a helper really made a big difference, as we could keep the clamping pressure even along both sides as we added more down the line. I left it in the press for 2 days to ensure the epoxy was fully cured, and let me tell you, those are the longest 2 days of my life. Itching to see how well it worked, I pulled off the clamps and went to lift the top off the mold. That's when I ran into another problem. It was a little stuck. While the fabric did help the board to not stick to the foam, the epoxy could still seep through it, causing the foam to be glued together. I ended up having to break the mold off chunks at a time, which is a bit disappointing as I was hoping to be able to use it again in the future. Although the disappointment was short-lived as I saw the board start to appear below and the realization that I almost had a snowboard. I then took it over to my bandsaw and cut the rough shape of the board out, staying back from the metal edge, which unfortunately my batteries went on strike again, so you don't get to see that part. Although once it was all cut out, I flushed everything up to the metal edge at the spindle sander and then hand sanded over everything again. After peeling off the masking tape, I sanded the top sheet up to 220 grit. I then began working on flattening out the base. Now, I don't recommend using the drum sander in this way. Although it did prove effective for this purpose, it's not how the tool is designed to be used, and that could create problems for both you and the machine. Now, if you remember way back in the beginning, I mentioned the foam stiffness caused a problem in the layup. Apparently, the mold cupped slightly under the pressure of the clamps, and that caused my base to be slightly concaved. Because of this, I couldn't fully flatten my base or else I would sand through it into the core. So I got as close as I could and then moved on to finishing the top, hoping it wouldn't affect how it rode that much. For the finish, I just used a regular wipe-on poly, sanding between every couple coats, doing 6 in total. I then sprinkled a little bit of iron powder over where the binding inserts were, which showed me where I needed to drill out the veneer. Then I used a special 21-degree router bit with a bearing to chamfer the edges of the snowboard, continuing that angle around the tip and tail by sanding. Next, I used a file guide and added a 2-degree bevel to the metal edges on the side of the board. This just helps the board to ride smoother in the snow and not try to throw you to the ground as much, which sounds good to me. I then waxed the board with a lot of wax. It was quite dry from all the work that had been done to it. And then once it dried, I scraped all of the excess off and did it again just to make sure that the base was fully saturated. Lastly, I mounted the bindings onto the board to complete the setup. And here is how the board came out. But I know what you're thinking, how well does it actually work? And for that, let's head out to the ski hill and find out. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how it came out, and the feeling of riding my own snowboard down a mountain was beyond amazing. If you enjoyed the video, then please like and subscribe, and if you have any thoughts, let me know down in the comments, and thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.